The Bolsheviks could have produced different state structures which impeded the creation of a dictatorship. Separation of powers was one thing that was being proposed, in which different bodies would have had clearly articulated responsibilities. In the absence of this, what ends up happening is you have this institutional incoherence in which it kind of necessitates for a party to come in as an outside arbiter. So I talk about in that video, for example, the Shlapnikov incident, in which the government was kind of brought to a standstill because they weren't sure who could do what. You didn't have these constitutional norms with which to appeal to. You didn't have a Supreme Court. A Supreme Court was eventually founded, but as a non-independent branch. So ultimately, you had to have the party come in as this outside mediator and say, look, we're all Bolsheviks here. How about we'll just move you to this position and you to this position? And that's how the dispute ended up being solved, instead of ever creating any in-house governmental solution. So you end up necessitating the creation of a party mediator who dictates above the government. And I tend to value the long-term stability of a system. So, in theory, you take something like an absolute monarchy. A monarchy could be the best system ever, right? If you have an extremely wise, benevolent ruler for 40 years, that's a very desirable scenario. But then what happens is, if the monarch dies and you go to a horrible ruler, or if there's no clear ruler, and in fact, it seems to be the case even that there's a correlation between a good ruler producing the conditions for a poor ruler, and or the desirability of this absolute power being so enticing and the stakes so high that it kind of incentivizes these power grabs and instability in the system. And this kind of gets into the whole Plato's philosopher kings thing about how you need to impose certain training upon monarchs. The reason why I broadly support democracy is that, on average, it seems to produce the most stability from generation to generation to generation. So then when you look at the Soviet system, it failed to reproduce itself over generations and generations. I mean, depending on your particular strain, you believe it was only successful for a few generations, or maybe even only one generation, the Stalin generation. So now, what does that tell you about the utility of the system for producing desirable results long term? It almost implies we need to go back to the drawing board on the system, because you can't have a system that's producing instability every generation, bringing the system to the brink of collapse, if you're trying to work toward a long-term goal like communism.
It's been how many years since Russian Revolution? Over 100?
Yeah.
And that's what I find interesting, because within the Marxist theory, there's a latent excuse for not going to the drawing board, which is this argument against so-called utopian socialism, that, well, you don't really know what's going to actually happen and be possible as the material conditions develop. Therefore, thinking of any structuring of regime is mere intellectual masturbation. But what I actually think is Marxism often serves as a kind of opium of the intellectual in coping away from thinking about these tough questions. Because if you look at the way they talk about it often, is like, oh, this will resolve itself with the international revolution, or we'll see it happen. This is my favorite one. The proletariat will figure it out.
Yeah.
Right?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
I'm not saying I'm going to rule the world or I'm going to change the world, but I guarantee that I will spark the brain that will change the world, and that's our job. We might not be the ones, but let's not be selfish, and because we're not going to change the world, let's not talk about how we should change it.
By moderately conservative, I mean simply, before you act, think well about all possible consequences.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
If you want to do politics, you got to fucking understand the issues. It's not all just emotions and fantasy life.
Remember, my friend, a wise man can learn more from a foolish question than a fool can learn from a wise answer.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I am here with NOJ Rants. Who I have on the channel today is a YouTuber and not just any other YouTuber. As I've said before in podcasts, I hate interviewing YouTubers, and now I'm very selective these days with which ones I have on. And he's one of the best up-and-coming channels when it comes to this sort of space that I'm more or less kind of adjacent to. His channel specializes in Soviet history as of now. And I'm not just glazing here, but probably the best Soviet history non-mainstream YouTube channel that there is in terms of detail. And genuinely, I think a really important contribution to the space, because what you have when it comes to Soviet history are mainstream historians who usually come from one angle. And then in response to that, there's been people who respond to that vacuum and fill it with a kind of equally biased history from their own standpoint, usually a Marxist-Leninist standpoint of some kind. And I think part of why people are really confused now is because they haven't really learned anything. So it's easy to learn it from a YouTuber. And I accept this as reality. People, you can't just expect post-literate society to suddenly change and everyone to start reading. So I like to recommend people to watch people who read. And one of the most scholarly, in-depth videos is NOJ Rants' videos. The newest one is very long. It's on how the Soviet Union's government actually worked. The video that blew him up, the one that first recommended to me, was Lenin and the Soviets. But without further ado, before we get into the weeds of today's topic, which is the myths of Soviet history, is there anything that you would like to say to introduce yourself?
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for that great introduction. I am NOJ Rants. Do not give in to the revisionist tendency to say NOJ or NOJ. It's NOJ. Just as Marx intended.
Do you have like a first name or like a nickname I can call you? Because I just feel very uncomfortable by their YouTube names.
Yeah, well, as you might be able to guess, it's John, Jon.
Okay, that makes it so much better.
Yeah.
NOJ, I feel
John Nodge, yeah.
sounds like a gamer tag of someone in FaZe Clan or something. Like I go NOJ, it's like, you know, NOJ the Quick Scoper. That's what I'm like thinking.
Yeah. Well, I had NOJ raps for my mixtapes and such. And then, yeah. And then so it just became NOJ Rants, because I basically just rant on the internet. That was the idea behind making the channel. And
that's like so not what you do either.
Yeah, it went
your
in a weird direction.
Your videos are like really well put together scripts, and
thank you.
With like these crazy animations that, especially recently, I have to say, as a creator myself, I was almost suffering on behalf of you watching that video. I haven't even finished the most recent one because it's very long, and I will, I promise. But one of those videos where I actually had to watch it, not just listen, because of how well produced the visuals were. But just like from what I've seen so far, I was like, dude, this must be suffering making this video.
A little bit. I was kind of driven crazy. I've been working on that video basically all year, and I only recently, I realized last Friday was the anniversary of the October Revolution, and I was like, oh, perfect deadline. I'll finally force myself to finish. And I was really struggling. I pulled an all-nighter on the 6th, and then released it at like 9 a.m. and then went to bed after that. But just barely made it over the finish line. Only went crazy a little bit. So glad to hear people
doing
like
quite
it.
Well. It's doing quite well so far. So I hope more people will watch it, especially people who are interested in this history. But, you know, the first question I got to ask is, how does someone like yourself come to be so obsessed with Soviet history? Because, look, I know it takes one to know one. You have to have a certain degree of obsession to be very scholarly rigorous. And your videos are extremely scholarly rigorous. In fact, your video on this, how the Soviet government worked, is so impressive, and it's impressive as well as the last one was already very good. Because, you know, like, nobody knows how the Soviet government actually worked. Nobody actually knows. Nobody.
Mhm.
I've read a lot of Soviet history books, and they'll explain all the details of events, of wars, of political changes, of purges, of various things. But in terms of the structure itself, like I've seen Shea Lewin articulate it in The Soviet Century. I've learned as to how it works, but it's so complicated. It's like the most crazy bureaucratic matrix ever that it's just like hard to understand and definitely hard to remember how exactly things were working. And what I find very deceptive is some people like this book. I'm sure you've heard of it. It's horrible, but it's called Soviet Democracy by Pat Sloan.
Mhm. Yep.
Yeah, it gets recommended by some like very pro ML people, Marxist Leninist people, to say like this is how it worked, and he's explaining like how it works in theory, kind of very divorced.
I have a lot of thoughts. Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I remember reading that. I'm like, this doesn't make any sense just based on the events that transpired. But when you learn about how it actually worked, that's like a whole other story. But I think that's the important question: is like, how the hell was the system structured? And yeah, how the hell did you get into this shit, man?
Well, it was a long road. First, let me just say, the reason why I even made that video, why I kind of bumped it up in my list of videos to make, is I noticed, like you said, basically every single person, especially on YouTube, on Reddit, whatever, is very incorrect. In the sense of not even giving the correct pro-Soviet version, in that they're explaining it, they're mixing up the state and the party, or just leaving out the party. And to be fair, most people focus on the Stalin Constitution, which was sort of consciously crafted to be more broadly appealing and amenable to liberal democratic sensibilities. But people are using these very liberal parliamentarian terms and talking about separation of powers and legislative and executive branches and all these things that the Soviets technically rejected. That was one of the hallmarks of the system, the lack of separation of powers. And as for how I got into this, I don't know. It was a long and crazy road. People ask me this a lot. I don't have any connections to the former Soviet Union. I'm not from Russia or anything like that. I've always been very big into history, but history of all kinds. And then I think it was as I started to become older, enter adulthood, I became a lot more politically active and conscious, which led me toward political science, the investigation of different ideologies. And I was sort of drawn to the Soviet project because it was this unique experience in the history of ideology, in the history of politics, and how it has affected modern politics. So I started going down this rabbit hole, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more, but I was never, and I still don't identify as like an anti-communist or anything. I never had a motivation to like, I need to stop the Soviets. I never had it. And I'm sure maybe some people won't believe that, but it was the contrary, if anything. I just found it so fascinating, the entire history. And I sort of gravitated to it and I picked it as my focus of study. And the rest is history, they say.
Yeah, I was wondering if it had to do with some like academic background or something, because clearly there's a level of dedication in this. You cite a lot of sources. All your sources are cited in your videos, and we can get into later, as the podcast progresses, so the particular Soviet historians, because I don't want to lose the normies right away, but yeah, it does require dedication to really dig into this. And I think off the bat, what I'll say, what your videos fill in terms of the void I see in Soviet history is the Lenin period. Because for me, actually, a great bulk of my knowledge of Soviet history is really after the death of Lenin. So just to lay my cards, basically, my introduction to Soviet history, a lot of it was, histories of the Russian Revolution first. So like Neil Faulkner, People's History of the Russian Revolution, then Sheila Fitzpatrick on Shortest History of the Soviet Union. China Medieval, October, and then a bunch of books which are basically more geared towards the Stalin period and everything after. So like Moshe Lewin, Arch Getty, and Fitzpatrick again, her Everyday Stalinism. And there's a few others like Kotkin, which is, entirely on Stalin, right?
Well, you'd be surprised.
So it's like, well, he talks about Lenin. He definitely talks about Lenin, but it's generally more Stalin focused. And when it comes to like the pro and anti-Soviet kind of accounts or sympathetic accounts, like including Trotsky. So Trotsky is an example, History of the Russian Revolution. That's another classic. There's a lot of specifics in the Lenin period that are completely left out and not talked about, that change the whole narrative, because there's particular narratives you see, and they break off usually with Stalin. They say you can tell someone's ideology based on when you think the October Revolution, or when the revolution period was sabotaged. So if you think the Bolsheviks sabotaged it, you're probably like either a moderate like SR Menshevik type, or a left com, or not a left com, like a libertarian anarchist. Yeah, anarchist for sure. If you think that Lenin and all that was like great, but Stalin betrayed the revolution, you're probably a Trotskyist or a kind of left communist. Or, there's a lot of different types of people like that. I would say that's a more common type. In fact, with a lot of Marxists, there's a tendency to at least be very sympathetic to the Lenin period, and see everything went to shit in the Stalin period. And the narrative is like kind of like, okay, well, Lenin, yes, stuff was fucked, but like they had to do everything. Or, and it's also discuss how much, probably the one that did go into the Lenin period the most for me was actually the book Leninism by Neil Faulkner. But there was particular things that I didn't even quite know in terms of like the chronology of events, the sequencing of events, until your video on Lenin and the Soviets on the Civil War. I'll get to exactly what part, which is, I think, a crucial change in the narrative. I don't know if there's anything you would like to add to what I just said first regarding your...
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's certain meta narratives that are used to kind of solve the problem of the revolution and make sense of it. And like you said, these often break down along major points of divergence. So if you believe it was diverted in 1917, 1918, one branch goes off. If you think it fell apart in 1924, another branch goes off. If you think it fell apart in 1956, another branch goes off, and so on. So yeah, there's all these different
or with
branches.
Gorbachev.
Yeah, and then finally like the 1980s branch. Yeah.
Yeah. If you think it fell off with Khrushchev, then you're kind of like an anti-revisionist Stalinist type. If you think it fell off with Gorbachev, you're like a Brezhnevite, right? The generic Marxist-Leninist, the general ones.
Yeah, such a funny term, but yeah.
It is, but it's funny because it does capture a difference, like I've never been quite convinced by the Trotskyist tendency to just call everything Stalinist, because people have very different conceptions of how things happened, which reveal what their conception of socialism even is.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I kind of define it as like these meta narratives. And often I find that people are very quick to see a video or whatever and try to slot it into one of these narratives and assuming, oh, it's Trotskyist or it's anarchist, and then kind of put it into one of these boxes, sometimes just based on the thumbnail. Although, to be fair, I do have the one saying Trotsky was right, but it's like about a very specific claim. But people will see that and say, okay, it's a Trotskyist. He believes this, this, and this. We can ignore him on this, this, and that. And the thing is, it's actually kind of what I try to avoid, in that I'm not setting out to give you the Trotskyist view or any specific view. It may be the case that a video is incidentally kind of favorable to a Trotskyist view, but then other times the video might be completely negative. So, and in fact, I think some of the videos that I have coming up are I'm probably going to piss off the Trotskyists too soon enough.
Oh, yeah. Well, look, when I first recommended your channel was in the iceberg video I did explaining every type of Marxism. It was the video you did. That was one of your shorter videos debunking that notion, that argument that is always said by Marxist-Leninists, which is the CIA actually, in a report, admitted that Stalin is not a dictator and that he has collective leadership behind him. They then just kind of like throw that at you as like evidence to just forget anything about Stalin, totalitarianism that
appeal
didn't
to
happen.
authority. Yeah.
I want to kind of bust. I want to kind of like bust you to bust that real quick before we go into the more what I think will be a kind of more mind fuck for people, which is how in the Russian Civil War.
Well, so to make a long story short, it's mostly a misunderstanding. It's not a statement by the CIA. It's an anonymous, unverified report submitted to the CIA, and one which evidently they didn't seem to think was very credible anyway. It's contradicted by all these other reports submitted to and within the CIA. And furthermore, it's not exactly making a statement on whether or not the system as a whole is a democracy. It's making a specific statement about the current situation in the 1950s from an espionage perspective, saying these are the current leaders who may rise or fall, and kind of offhandedly just saying there had always been some collective leadership in affecting that. The implication being that under Stalin it was very low, but that's basically to make a statement about the leadership style, not necessarily to comment on the entire system as a whole. But in general, it's a very fallacious argument to just throw this out there and say, aha, this proves it, they're a democracy. Because again, that's not what it's saying. But also, that's not how you form and substantiate such an argument. By appealing to, well, these guys said so, we trust the CIA on this one all of a sudden. You have to look at and analyze the fundamental structure from the inside, not just what the CIA was able to discern from afar based on one anonymous source. And if you want, I would actually argue there's 4 main types of sources that people use when trying to argue that the Soviet Union was a democracy. The CIA document being the first. The second is sometimes they'll just cite the Constitution and say, well, it says it right there. It says that they're a democracy, or it describes a democracy on paper.
Yeah, people forget that Stalin said, in Stalin's constitution, it had the freedom of speech, freedom of association, and it was said to be a democracy.
Exactly. So case closed.
Sounds crazy, but that was what the Constitution said.
Yeah. And the obvious problem with that is just you have to look at how this piece of paper is actually enforced in practice. Any constitution could say anything. I think the Nazi Germany constitution, I believe, said that there was freedom of religion. And we all know that didn't work out. You can even take American examples where all men are created equal. But then we know all men weren't treated equal across history. You have to look at how these things actually manifested in the real world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, until the Republican Party bashed the skulls of the dirty Confederates, that is. I'm just kidding. But yeah, no, that's like just citing the CIA as a credible source all of a sudden is interesting in itself. If we assume that that piece of evidence was at all evidence of anything, like it's okay. Well, if you bring up if you bring up like death counts or whatever, the argument is, oh no, it was the CIA propaganda.
Yeah.
But when it's suddenly the CIA is like a good source. What? It's also just the concept of taking ideas at their word.
Yeah.
Itself is
selectively as well.
Yeah.
The other 2 types. So then, like as you were saying before, you have in the 1930s when the Stalin Constitution was created. They invited and instructed and funded all these fellow travelers and communists to come to the Soviet Union and write works kind of lauding the new system So this is like your Pat Sloans, your Beatrice and Sidney Webb, E. Holmes, and all these works. Like, even if you put aside the massive conflict of interest bias problem of they're communists specifically instructed to write praise of the system, these would still not be a good source just because it's a highly limited primary source from a century ago, written by laymen without access to the full picture with all the information we have now about how the system worked. It could be used as a good source for what some people thought at the time or wanted people to think at the time. And it's funny because Nazi Germany actually did the same thing at around the same time. In the late 30s, they also invited all these academics and intellectuals to come to Germany. And they wrote these books about, oh, look, the society is so free and things are working pretty well under the Nazis. And we can all recognize intuitively that, well, you can't just trust that, yeah, obviously. But it's weird how, in regards to like the Pat Sloans, and I think funny enough, Pat Sloan even disavowed his work later on. But
Really?
it's funny how, yeah.
That would actually be funny because I would love to use that in a quote tweet the next time someone
I believe it was
that at
him.
me.
Yeah, I believe it was him. How a few decades later he disavowed the work. It was one of them. They disavowed the work and said like, yeah, I had no idea what I was talking about. But it's funny how we all intuitively know you can't just trust a piece of state-sponsored propaganda, essentially. Although I hate to use that word since it's just so overused, but in the very literal sense, state-sponsored propaganda, we all know we can't trust that, but then we'll trust this piece of state-sponsored propaganda. Oh, yeah, clearly, Pat Sloan was 100% correct. And then just the fact, I know I'm kind of going on a huge tangent, but then the fourth type of source that they'll use is any number of revisionist sources from the last few decades, looking at how, oh, the system was a little more participatory here or a little more democratic here. And what that kind of fails to capture is that totalitarianism in general, in any country, has begun to be questioned. For example, in regards to the Russian Empire, there's been countless works looking at, oh, it turns out in the empire, there was elements of participatory politics, democratic consensus. There was certain structures which limited the Tsar. There was the Boyar Duma. There was the Zemsky Sobor, depending on the time period. And of course, the Tsar couldn't control everything, and maybe in spite of what he wanted, because in any system, you're limited by practicality and the limits of communication technology and just what you're able to affect. And so maybe the idea of a 10 out of 10 absolutist state needs to be rejected. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's a 1 out of 10 now. You can't go to the opposite extreme and say, because we've examined how, not necessarily anyway, because we've examined how the system isn't as totalitarian as we thought, now suddenly it's a democracy. We don't do that for the Russian Empire, I don't think. No leftist says the Russian Empire was a democracy. So by that same token, you have to contextualize what these sources are actually saying and not jump to the opposite extreme. You know what I mean?
It's fascinating the way they use these kind of arguments. Like they take totalitarianism not working or not accomplishing its goal as evidence of totalitarianism not existing. Like, oh,
Yep.
they didn't control everything, therefore let's not talk about it. That's more or less what it boils down to.
Yeah.
They really have a strange way that where they don't factor in scale at all. Like they would do this with authoritarianism too. They'll say, well, every state is authoritarian because a state is a monopoly on violence that uses coercion. Therefore, the USSR and the USA are equally as authoritarian, or that authoritarian is meaningless as a category. And it's like, no one ever said, no one sophisticated defines authoritarianism as how much bad thing you do, right? Like in many ways, South Africa was, more liberal than like, I don't know, Nasser's Egypt, but that didn't make it better in the sense that like authoritarianism has to do with the concentration of power, not with like just how much bad things the state does, or like the prisons or whatever. It's concentration of power. So it's, how few hands is power concentrated, right? That would be like the way you look at authoritarianism. Totalitarianism's a different thing in that it's the blending of the party and the state in society. So like, I'm just saying this for the audience. I already know you know this, but because I get always at least a few comments every time I use this word, where people will like say, "Oh, this is just a made up word. It's just bullshit." Well, it's like, there's a reason these words exist. Like, for example, Salazar, it's Portugal, or even Franco, Spain. These are brutal dictatorships. They suck ass. They're not totalitarian regimes. In the sense that no one, like Franco's Spain, Chomsky has this great bit on this actually, where people didn't really care what you were reading or what you were thinking. Like you could even have your like bookshop where you read communist literature. But if you try to join a union against the state or tried to at all challenge the state, they'd throw you in the torture chamber. Whereas the project of a totalitarian regime is to shape society in the way it wants. So this can be for like, the fascists want to shape its ideal of the nation, right? And impose that on society and subordinate all institutions in society to the state with the kind of Marxist-Leninist regimes. I mean, not all of them were totalitarian. I think actually in the post-Stalin period, a lot of the regimes kind of lessened how much control they had. That doesn't mean that they weren't authoritarian or weren't shitty, but like I would say Cuba, for example, is not a totalitarian state, even though it's a one-party authoritarian state, compared to the likes of North Korea, right? Where North Korea, internet's totally controlled. Who can leave the country is totally controlled. Virtually almost everything is controlled by the party, right? And that's a key difference, is that shape. And you could say it's for a goal of, often the way communist ideology gets used to justify this sort of thing, because we want to cleanse society of its bourgeois ideology and create a new man, a new society that's used to do this sort of endless purging. And it's not a coincidence, right, that the anti-revisionists, communists, were the most totalitarian. If you look at like Enver Hoxha in Albania, Stalin in the USSR, or Kim Il-sung, or Ceausescu, Ceausescu is another fucking mixed bag, but these tended to be like the most aggressively controlling parts. Examples, and it's part of that is that component. So like, when people are using these terms, it's not just all hyperbolic, but it's strange that they will point to this, revisionist history that you mentioned. So when you're saying revisionist, it's not in the same way like Marxist-Leninists use it. For those who don't know, when you say a revisionist historian, just means that they're kind of going against like what is a dominant narrative in history, is the scholarship so far. So like that would include Sheila Fitzpatrick and Arch Getty, who do a good job of sort of decentering Stalin from everything to show that actually a lot of the ways things happened were more complicated. And anyone who actually like reads their works, like let's say Everyday Stalinism by Sheila Fitzpatrick or Road to Terror by Arch Getty, it's pretty clear, at least to me, you can let me know what you think, that their whole point is that like these regimes were massive fuck-ups and were disasters, but the reasons why were far beyond like one man, like Stalin just controlling everything like a supercomputer. Like, no, there's so much involved.
Yeah.
The weird way I've seen some Marxist-Leninist YouTubers who will not be named right now use this is to say Stalin wasn't in charge of everything. Therefore, the whole, propaganda is wrong. Therefore, it's not his fault. So therefore, Stalin good.
Got him.
Whereas my impression was actually I became more anti-Soviet from the Arch Getty book, because I was like, oh, if you really cannot it shows how deep this problem was, deeply embedded it was, to a point where I feel like I'm very unconvinced that if another leader took power aside from Stalin, that it would have necessarily been that much better.
Yeah. Well, yeah, the first thing about that is what people have to realize, these terms are for greater specification. They're not necessarily normatively loaded. Personally, I use these terms like Stalinist, totalitarian very sparingly, but these terms have very specific use cases and aren't just to say it's bad. It's to describe a very specific phenomenon that we're trying to elicit discussion on. And to your second point, the whole totalitarian versus revisionist paradigm is heavily misunderstood. There's sort of this pop history understanding of the two, that you had two schools, the totalitarian school and the revisionist school. Sometimes these are incorrectly labeled as conservative versus liberal or anti versus pro-Soviet, but that's not what it's about at all. What these things are two, among many, there's more than two, but these are two broad frameworks and schools of thought about ways to approach Soviet history. So the totalitarian school approaches Soviet history through the lens of the leadership, looking at from the top down, how did the leaders affect the system? And by the way, no totalitarianist was ever under the impression that Stalin literally did everything. If you read these people like Richard Pipes, Robert Conquest, what have you, they're all aware of other factors. But they thought it was fruitful to approach the history in this way, as a starting point. Now, of course, many of them were very Stalin-centric as a result of this, to the point of perhaps missing nuance. I'm not saying they're above criticism, but that's sort of the starting point for this approach. Now, the revisionist school is characterized by social and cultural history, from the bottom up essentially, looking at how different interest groups within society were contributing factors and how the masses shaped the leadership instead of just the other way around. So that's sort of the quick fundamental difference. Now, there's also these politics involved and the famous battle of totalitarianists and revisionists clashing. Many totalitarianists were also Cold Warriors. But the point is, these weren't just two monolithic, one after the other paradigms that you had to fall into. I guess what I'm trying to say is, it wasn't 100% totalitarian versus 0% totalitarian. There was more nuance between the two and even within the two.
Yeah, a big part of what leads to the new wave of revisionist scholarship is the archives. Like after the Soviet Union comes down, there's all of these archives that are briefly actually opened and then closed up later. Because I believe you can't really just, I think you can't just like get access to them now. There was like a period where you could, right?
Well, so it depends on the archive. There is no monolithic Soviet archives. It's an umbrella term usually to refer to the over a dozen central state archives in Moscow, which over the course of several mergers and renamings acquired the main previously classified government records and Communist Party records. And so certain collections are open to the public. Other archives might be invitation only or by request of scholars. And certain records are actually still classified, especially retaining to some of the operations of the secret police are deemed to still be relevant to Russian national security and are usually within the FSB archives. And then the term could also include regional and local archives across the country and in other former Soviet countries. And maybe in the broadest sense, it could even refer to archives completely outside the former Soviet Union, which have a Soviet documentary focus. But more often than not, what people mean is this handful of about a dozen archives in Moscow.
Yeah, because that was the one where you had a couple key historians, like, so Sheila Fitzpatrick, from the top of my head, Sheila Fitzpatrick, Arch Getty, and Stephen Kotkin, who's the history's Joe Pesci. People should listen to him talk. He's fun to listen to. This like kind of short Italian guy with a squeaky voice. But yeah, they got access to some of Moscow's archives and were able to like write a lot of interesting works, pointing out interesting things based on that.
Absolutely, yeah. And if they're not completely closed, many historians refer to this kind of Wild West of just before and after the Soviet Union fell. There was just this mass declassifying and recategorizing of all these documents. So compared to that, it's kind of been reined back in a little bit, but many documents are still widely available. And then obviously you have with the war in Ukraine, many foreign scholars have been unable to travel to research in these archives. So that's something to consider as well.
So I think now would be a perfect time to get into some of the biggest myths when it comes to understanding Soviet history, both among the left and right. Okay, let's not even make this politics, but I say left and right just because it's sort of assumed by people who get into Soviet history and they kind of like, after previously not knowing anything, that where they assume that the general public is completely clueless on Soviet history, and that the general consensus or dominant narratives are just completely wrong, and that once they learn a little bit, they know so much more. But there's certain myths that it seems like are pervasive within even Marxist circles or various circles. And I want to get to the Civil War, the Russian Civil War and the Lenin period. What are some of the biggest myths when it comes to the Russian Civil War? The question that I'll point to, because for me, what I thought was really revealing in your book, your video on Lenin and the Soviets, was how exactly the Civil War transpired. Because look, this is the narrative that you see with all communists generally, unless they're anarchist, is the Marxist, Leninist, Trotskyist, Leninist sympathizers, or just Soviet sympathizers, regardless if they disagree on Stalin, what they generally kind of often agree is they see what happened is basically you had the Russian, you had the Russian Revolution, then you had the October takeover with the Bolsheviks, which was, they see it as a response to the war, the incompetence of the Kerensky government, and also a response to a potential coup by the General Kornilov. And that after that, you had the Civil War. It just happened. And then all the countries started sending in their troops, and you had a civil war where you had the White Army, which was supposedly super big, backed by all the imperialist powers, against the Bolshevik government. And the Bolshevik government thus had to establish a one-party dictatorship, war communism, as it was called, centralizing power and creating the Cheka, the secret police, to restore order, basically. And that when Lenin died, whoopsie, Stalin took over and then expanded it forever. What was supposed to be a temporary dictatorship, expanded it into a permanent one. That's sort of the narrative, right? This imperialist encirclement idea. What do you think people generally get wrong when it comes to all that?
Okay. The first thing that you alluded to is there's often a compression of the timeline and chronological confusion in general. So the way it's usually described is you had the revolution and then you had the Civil War. But what this skips over is that, for one, there was sort of this liminal time period of 6 months to a year in which the embryonic civil war that emerged was being formed, and in which the different sides and concentration of forces were being determined. There was this entire symbiotic push and pull that was contributing to the civil war that emerged. And that's kind of the main crux of the video that I released on the Bolsheviks versus the Soviets. And I should say I appreciate how you summarize it, because it's not about saying the Bolsheviks had no support or anything like that. It's saying, well, they had a decent amount of support among the working class going into the winter of 1917, 1918. From a confluence of factors and choices and decisions, some within the Bolsheviks' control, some not, such as the signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the failing economic situation, the demobilization of the army. All of this caused their amount of support to decline. In some cases, the workers were enticed to the Mensheviks or the SRs, but probably for most of them, they were simply voting for anyone but the Bolsheviks, in a classic vote against the incumbent situation. So, in the spring of 1918, we see a surge of opposition votes in the Soviets, which threatened to unseat the Bolshevik government, or at least force through some kind of power sharing, to which the Bolsheviks responded by clamping down on elections and muscling out the other parties, which in some cases escalated into serious violence on both sides of the Bolsheviks attacking the opposition parties, causing the opposition parties to attack the Bolsheviks. And this cycle of violence then spiraled into the Civil War proper, with, for example, the leftist Kamuch government coming together from the people's militias formed to defend the Soviets in the Volga region. What ends up happening is this cycle of violence destabilizes the Bolshevik government. It destabilizes these local regions most of all, and the emerging white movement surges into being in the areas most devastated by this violence. So the premise I'm making is that this war against the Soviets to kind of ensure and force through a monopoly, it actually catalyzed a more extensive civil war in terms of making the Bolsheviks less prepared and fighting a more formidable force than maybe they would have had to. I'm also looking at in that video about why was there opposition? The idea being that, well, yes, the Mensheviks antagonized the Bolsheviks, eventually did plots against the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks also antagonized them and kind of put them into this resistance stance, creating a kind of feedback loop. And the video also highlights how the Mensheviks didn't have total control on the ground of everything that was going on with their local members, and neither did the Bolsheviks. It was also these local forces fighting between each other and amongst themselves, of Bolsheviks against Bolsheviks, attacking Mensheviks, attacking neutral parties, and what ends up happening as a result of this is it pushes a lot of people into the arms of the whites. It pushes them into the arms of other anti-Bolshevik forces, and also pushes a lot of people into these third-party positions of supporting neither, like the Greens, or just into neutrality in defending their own local interests against all sides. So, and again, the chronology of all this is the Bolsheviks come to power. The seizure of power is in November 1917. And then initially it's sort of up in the air if the Bolsheviks are going to work with the other socialist parties and form a broad socialist government. This conflict with and in the Soviets only really picks up in the spring of 1918, especially after the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, at a time in which the proto-white movement was near defeated. Lenin even famously declares in April that the Civil War was essentially over. They had eliminated the whites. But there's a series of choices being made in how the Bolsheviks consolidate their new government, which essentially reforms and coalesces a civil war proper in terms of frontline battles with formally declared sides. And this takes time to get off the ground, really only coming together by the end of the summer and the fall of 1918. And partially because of all this previous conflict and choices and government decisions. And similarly, the idea of a foreign intervention is kind of up in the air at first. It's not set in stone if these countries are going to invade, and if so, on what side and to what extent. The first shots of the British intervention aren't fired until around the end of August, maybe even September 1918, if I remember correctly. And even then, it takes time for these forces to build up and even have a contributing factor whatsoever. All this other formation has occurred before the Allied intervention is even a thought in anyone's mind, let alone heavily contributing to the conflict. So does that kind of answer what you were going for, or?
Yeah, well, there's so many points at which we could narrow in. But that's like itself important to say because, they act as if like the Allies just all came in at once. And what's often forgotten is that this is going to sound like I'm, doing apologetics for the US or something, but, just to understand the sort of facts of the matter, because it's portrayed as sort of like, they really want to see it as like good guys, bad guys kind of. Look, the United States recognized the October Revolution and actually supported it, not the Russian Revolution against the monarch, and really only started to be very critical of the Bolshevik government and became outright turned against it once the Bolsheviks established a one-party dictatorship. They started sending in troops quite later, much later, and as you said, even the British, who are actually much more paranoid about what was happening from the beginning, even they didn't really send troops till like 1918. So,
yeah, and they were originally invited by the Bolsheviks. People forget that.
Elaborate on that.
So let me back up, actually, because we're kind of getting into the myth of capitalist encirclement. I say myth primarily in the sense of mythology, like a constructed foundational narrative, but also myth meaning falsehood a little bit, though containing elements of truth. Because there's basically 4 big problems with the capitalist encirclement idea. And you hear this especially in regards to the Allied intervention. The 12 nations, 14 nations, 25 nations, 30 nations invaded. All these numbers are very
I used to buy this, by the way. There's an old podcast. There's an old podcast that I hope I took down. I think I might still be up, but it was me and it was the Marxist Project, who's actually otherwise a pretty good YouTuber. I would still recommend his videos on the Soviet Union's history. And it's interesting that when I listen and cringe at that episode I did, I hope I took it down. Maybe it might still be up on Spotify, but it's definitely down on YouTube because of the fucking Sylvester Stallone Stalin thumbnail. Horrible. But yeah, that one, the thing that was actually inaccurate in that pod is not actually even the Stalin part, which was the one that angered people the most. It was the Lenin part, because I kind of also uncritically took in a lot of the way in which that period is portrayed, because I'm not a Leninist, yet I still, from what I had learned, I was like, okay, well, can you really blame it? I mean, also there's this whole question of Russia is an undemocratic country, right? Russia is somehow inherently authoritarian, and it took place in this authoritarian country and it turned out authoritarian. I mean, what can you expect, especially after all of those countries came and tried to intervene? I mean, what do you want them to do? But it's so much of that, so much detail is left out, which I'll let you elaborate on.
Sure. So the first thing that people get wrong is treating and assuming these capitalist countries are a monolithic force, solely bent on the destruction of communism. If we look at even the Allied intervention, if you take, for example, the declassified minutes of the British cabinet meetings, where they're debating on whether or not to intervene, yes, it's true, there are some fervent anti-communists among them. People like Winston Churchill are talking about how we need to invade and stamp out communism specifically. But at the same time, a lot of them don't really care. They say they could call themselves whatever they want. In other words, they're looking at how it affects them, and specifically how it affects their ability to win the Great War. So the people pushing for intervention are often talking about, well, would it be advantageous? Would it allow us to secure weapons caches to prevent them from falling into the German hands? Would it apply pressure on the Germans and open up a second front? And so this is kind of what they really care about. And a lot of them are on the fence, don't really know what the point of an intervention would even be, what they could even realistically hope to achieve. And surprisingly, some of them are even kind of pro-Bolshevik.
Germany.
Right, but I mean, even within the British government, because some of them, they don't love communism by any means, but they're thinking maybe it would actually be worth allying with the Bolsheviks, especially if they'll continue to fight the Germans. Which is why it's really the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk that catalyzes the decision. Because prior to this, the British were actually cautiously supportive of the new government. I'm not saying they love the government or anything, or that it would have worked out, just that the intervention wasn't predetermined nor occurring from the beginning. And so, as I alluded to, the first British forces to land in Russia were technically invited. It was in a very limited capacity and sort of tepidly approved of, but nonetheless, they landed in Murmansk and the White Sea region in support of the Soviets in order to prevent these strategic locations from falling into the hands of the Germans. So the point is their motives were varied and primarily driven by self-interest in how best to win the Great War, with a lot of it after that just being inertia. Now that's just touching on the British, but in general, the entire Allied intervention is characterized by this confusion, this lack of coordination of why are they even there? What are they even accomplishing? So that's sort of the first big problem. The second big problem with the capitalist encirclement argument is that capitalist encirclement ebbs and flows over time and by country. There's periods of hostility with certain countries, but also periods of cooperation with the capitalist world. There's the Treaty of Friendship with Germany, for example, in which they're forming trade agreements and they're training each other's soldiers. And ironically, it's often the industrialists of these foreign countries who are pushing their governments to be on friendlier terms, because there's all these investment opportunities where the Ford Corporation is building factories in Soviet Russia. And
you're talking about the NEP period, right?
Well, so yes and no. So this is especially during the NEP, but it's also continuing into the industrialization, and especially after the Great Depression, actually, is when a lot of this is taking place.
You're skipping a few. It's like for the time, I just want you to like.
Okay, yeah.
Just mention like what years you're talking about.
Well, I'm just saying
like,
in general. In general, this is.
We're going from like the basically 1917 to like then.
Okay, yeah. So
skipping up.
I'm just saying in general, there's an ebb and a flow. So in one of the problems in general, during the Civil War, there's of course a series of countries who invade, but then there's also a period of time in which foreign countries are recognizing the Bolsheviks and trading with them, willing to work with them. This kind of brings me to the third point, which is that capitalist encirclement isn't a one-way street. Yes, these countries are often hostile to the Bolsheviks, but you wonder why. It's because the Bolsheviks are also hostile to them. They had this militant rhetoric of spreading the revolution, and they're funding communist parties and launching coup attempts and attempting to subvert these governments. And, you know, more power to them. But I'm just pointing out that in attempting to attack and subvert these governments, that kind of feeds into why these governments are hostile to them. And in fact, the great irony of the situation is that the countries that are the friendliest, that get the closest to the Bolsheviks, are the ones they attempt to subvert the most, taking advantage of those good graces. So the country that the Bolsheviks are on the best relations with during the 1920s is Germany. And yet Germany is the country they're trying to overthrow the most. Now, my point is, you know, they can do that, but what kind of signal is that sending to the international community? That if you try to work with us, we'll actually try to harm you even more.
Exactly. Like it changes. It's like, you know, if it's one thing to say you believe in the, you know, Marxist idea of like spreading the revolution everywhere, but you can't then go and act like the reaction came out of nowhere. Like that's just geopolitics. Like the way spreading the revolution appears between geopolitical states is you are trying to overthrow this government, destabilize my country. Okay, now I'm going to oppose you.
Yeah.
Whereas it's framed by the likes of Michael Parenti as if, like, you know, in his lectures, who introduces a lot of people to Soviet history,
right?
As if it just happened, and then like the foreign powers just all sent their troops, right?
Yeah, and it's actually kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy in that we shouldn't remove the agency from the Soviets themselves and act like that they were just being attacked by the entire world for no reason. And in fact, the Soviets shouldn't be treated as a monolith either. Because one funny thing that happens a lot is certain groups within the leadership, sort of the more realist among them, People like Grigory Chicherin, for example, the first foreign minister of the Soviet Union, he's talking about, look, I got a country to run. I just negotiated a pretty major trade deal, and then you guys blow it up for no reason, So there's kind of this tension between different institutions within the Soviet leadership and between different leaders about how best to spread the revolution, how best to build up the country. And if we talk about the purges, we'll get to this more, but there's also these contradictory projects in which the Soviets are kind of shooting themselves in the foot, sacrificing a lot of political capital, a lot of their international reputation for these other projects. But anyway, those are kind of the main broad problems with the capitalist encirclement idea.
Yeah, and also the way it's sometimes framed too, it's like as if it was all just class conflict and not geopolitical conflict.
Yeah.
Like the global bourgeois against the global proletarians. Because it's like Michael Parenti cites this particular thing, which was like, I forget, I think it was one of the U.S. presidents. It was before Roosevelt.
Hoover.
Herbert Hoover owned a factory that was nationalized in the USSR, and that's why like he was pushing so hard, and then like why the people in the U.S. government, who was headed by Wilson, acted faster in opposing the Bolsheviks. And it's like a little, because it's like the Bolsheviks also then invited the capitalists back with the new economic plan, and then the capitalists were happy to send their money, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's sometimes the opposite. It's the capitalists, not all, but there's times where it's the capitalists driving the British and American governments to recognize the Soviets, because it's this huge trading opportunity in which the Soviets are inviting foreign investors and engineers and foreign capital to come in and build these factories and receive these concessions. And that goes on really strongly into the early to mid 1930s.
Yeah, people need to think about it this way, because it's easy to look at it like it's just pro-communism versus anti-communism. The way a lot of people were looking at movements in the early 20th century was modernizing projects. So like the hope of having a post, like a government that wasn't the czarist, right, was that you would have like a modernizing project. Because part of the reason why certain countries did not develop was because there was an elite in power that it was not in their interests to essentially like have a competing elites, which a fully capitalist economy versus a semi-feudal economy, which is what Russia was, which was like, it had capitalism in the industrial cities, but still it had this huge peasantry and still like a kind of very limited system where, like a lot of the people it didn't have like a large proletariat. And proletariat is, on the one hand, for the Marxist point of view, good for socialism. It's a precondition for socialism, but it's also like good for capitalism. Right. So in a situation like Russia, it's not that hard to see why capitalists were willing to support it, in the sense that, look, capitalists happily support China, right? They pour tons of money into China, Deng Xiaoping, right? Or Mussolini was, this is a very different example, but Mussolini was supported by a lot of the Western world in the original, like in the first few years in power, because he was seen as someone who, one, brought stability and a modernization to Italy. And that stability thing is crucial. Like, people are more willing to invest in countries that are stable, regardless of what kind of government's in power. If it's stable, you can bet that like you can maybe make money. Whereas like it doesn't really matter the ideology. If you put money in a country, it could be as capitalist as ever, but if it's unstable, then your investment's probably going to be unstable, right?
Yeah, these are the material conditions. The material conditions I keep hearing about.
Yeah, okay, so there's a lot of things to pick apart here as well when it comes to this history. So another thing that's very important to say is the U.S. part of another reason why like you have more willingness to support the USSR is it wasn't clear that the Bolsheviks were establishing a total dictatorship yet. And even when they did, many capitalists were willing to like, send their money with the new economic plan. But part of like the skepticism of Bolshevism, and especially this idea of looking at Bolshevism as a kind of virus spreading throughout Europe. You know, you get this rhetoric from like Winston Churchill in England, and you start to, that's kind of also like a birth of modern fascism in Italy, arises in response to the Bolshevik dictatorship and the attempt to export that across, right? So why in Italy, you know, you get Mussolini being a former guy who actually praised Lenin a lot, to somebody who became the biggest arch nemesis of communism. So there's some detail here. And look, what I want you to highlight when it comes to the dictatorship is the way the history is typically portrayed is that the one-party dictatorship was established as a response that was necessary due to the imperialist encirclement in the Civil War. What's wrong about this?
Well, first, just as a broad point, there's sort of this problem of the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, which is essentially where if Y happened after X, Y must have been caused by X. But what this underappreciates is how Y could have happened in spite of X. It could have been actually limited by X. It could have been even more successful, or happened even sooner, or at an easier cost. There could have been multiple pathways to reach it, which at the very least have different trade-offs in that there's pros and cons to each choice. So I often get comments like, well, they had to do that because of the war. And in fact, the war vindicates it. They won in the end, so obviously it must have been the right choice. It allowed them to win the war. And I've been trying to think of ways to help explain this. So let me put it like this. I think people on the left, broadly, we would all support the United States over Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan during World War II. We all agree that the US would be preferable there, I hope. But we also all recognize that something like the internment of Japanese Americans was a huge misstep morally, was probably deleterious to the war effort in that it actually wasted resources and harmed more than it helped. And so you can very easily make an argument that it wasn't necessary to win the war. We can all point that out, and pointing this out does not mean necessarily that you support the other side or want Imperial Japan to win the war.
Unless you're W.E.B. Du Bois and a lot of anti-colonial leftists back then who thought Japan was actually an anti-colonial force.
Right, well, there's that, but
let's not get into that. Yeah.
But by that same token, I can point out how decisions made by Lenin during the Civil War may have not been necessary for winning it, may have actually been counterproductive to the war effort. And pointing that out doesn't mean I want the whites to win. It doesn't mean I necessarily want the Bolsheviks to lose. It's a point of criticism. And in fact, you can take it as a way to improve the revolution. You know, it's funny, I get comments from MLs responding positively to the videos sometimes, saying, okay, yeah, good point. That's something we need to be aware of. If we have a revolution in the future, we'll have to look out for that. Maybe we'll have to do this or this. So they actually take it as feedback, as like advice. That's fine. As opposed to the people who are like, that didn't happen. That never happened. There were no problems. There's no problems. Don't point that out. Like, you could take the videos as helping to improve your revolution, as opposed to just denying that there could be any problems or any flaws, in which case you're just liable to repeat the same mistakes over and over again. I mean, that's a whole nother rabbit hole, but does that answer your question? Or?
No, but now it's important detail. Because, look, the main thing I'm fishing for here is something you talked about most in depth in the Lenin's War on the Soviets video, which I thought was interesting, that it showed that not only did the establishment of the one-party dictatorship of the Bolsheviks and, the decline of any vestiges of one democracy period and Soviet democracy, like the kind of democracy Lenin claimed to be wanting to build, happened before the Civil War turned into an anti-communist war. Because when we talk about the Russian Civil War, a lot of people act as if the Kornilov coup against the government was like part of the same thing as what happened after the Encirclement, because Kornilov's failed coup plot was an attempt to bring back the monarchy.
Well,
And that actually wasn't very big. Like, it starts off, right, him being kind of like working with Kerensky, but then them turning against each other. But yeah.
Well, so the whole thing with Kornilov is this is an event that happens in August 1917 against the Kerensky government. So before the October Revolution even. And there's a number of causes for this. It's sort of debated, but directly it's believed to have been caused by a kind of miscommunication in which Kerensky believed these rumors about a coup, so he begins to alienate Kornilov, causing there to be a coup. Now, in general, this is a very small, very ill-conceived coup that doesn't get very far, but it's a coup against the Kerensky government over such things as their management of the war, for example. Now, even though it's kind of militarily this very minor event, that actually proved to be not much of a threat. The event becomes very important in retrospect as this watershed moment for the Bolsheviks, in that it allowed them to rapidly gain support as this party that came out against Kornilov from the beginning, whereas the Kerensky government is discredited. But that's kind of a whole other thing.
Yeah,
so.
but that's takes right that there was this constant threat against the revolution, and part of why the Bolsheviks justify the overthrow of Kerensky and taking the government was actually, and this will surprise listeners who aren't as familiar with the history, in the name of saving democracy. Kind of the great irony, right? The Bolsheviks come to power to preserve the Constituent Assembly. The Constituent Assembly. That bourgeois democracy, which Lenin would very quickly abandon and kind of had contradictory views on to begin with, which we'll go over.
Right.
Because it's like Lenin's somehow consistent and inconsistent at the same time. But with that, okay, so you get like this justification of the takeover in the name of stabilizing the revolution, also in the name of pulling out of World War I. And from there, okay, so you got Constituent Assembly. I'm just mapping out events, which for listeners, you get, well, one, the Bolsheviks trying to end the war, they basically give up a bunch of territory to Germany. They give up a lot of the Russian Empire, like a shit ton of it. This is the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And just to add this little detail in here, Germany helped push Lenin in power. This is not a conspiracy. This is pretty well established. I mean, it's why they gave him, protection to, like, when he left Russia, right? Why did Germany back Lenin? Well, obviously, he's destabilizing for the Russians who are for fighting the Germans.
Yes.
Duh. And he gives Germany a shit ton of territory. He gives Poland a bunch of territory. He gives a bunch of countries territory. And you can justify whether this is correct or not based in the name of internationalism or nationalism or whatever. But this provoked a huge reaction all across the board. And the right SRs, right, very much opposed this. The Socialist Revolutionary Party, which had two wings, the left wing and the right wing. One of the wings...
Well, even that that's arguably, there's a myth in regards to that as well.
Okay. I'll let you construct that as well, because this is the justification you tend to get from people who are sympathetic to the Bolsheviks is, okay, well, this treaty led to the first major violent resistance against the Bolshevik government, which caused the Bolsheviks, whether you think it was justified to clamp down on opposition or whether you view it as it gave the Bolsheviks an excuse to purge opposition and then set this sort of precedent where they would treat all other opposition peaceful or violent. This kind of in a very repressive way. It's interesting. It's actually to the point where, Domenico Lazzurdo, who's cited as a credible source by ML, is actually like points out stuff like this, but then gets very crucial details wrong, like saying Kerensky was a Menshevik. I just want to throw that out there because he's a really bad scholar, and it's become increasingly clear to me that he is. But what I mean is, like, what people are reading, this is, you get this idea that, like, okay, since the beginning, the Bolsheviks are just facing opposition all the time internally. So what you gonna do?
The thing is, so, yeah. Well, of course, there's opposition. There's always going to be opposition. Although there's sort of a word game being played here in that, in saying opposition, we're kind of combining violent, militant opposition with parliamentary, critical opposition, which is actually how a lot of this was being fought in the early stages. And it's ignoring the complexities of how the Bolsheviks were antagonizing the Mensheviks, just as the Mensheviks were antagonizing the Bolsheviks. I guess it's dialectical, if you want to use a fancy word. And then the first thing I was going to say in regards to the SRs, Lenin does something very brilliant here. And I mean this as a genuine compliment to his propagandic salesmanship in controlling the narrative surrounding the SRs. So originally there's the SR party, unhyphenated SRs, and a number of splits begin to occur. First, the left SRs begin to emerge and break off formally from the SRs proper. And then later, a very small minority of the remaining SRs began to become right SRs, a specific tendency that's different from the mainstream center SRs, we could say. But from the beginning, what Lenin does is he argues that if you're not at least a left SR, you're a right SR. Everyone is associated with the right. It's all right SRs. In so doing, he's able to associate all the varied SR branches and positions with the right SRs, with the most radical among them. He's also good at doing this kind of Leninist transitive property, where he'll say the Tsarist counter-revolution is supported by the Black Hundreds, and the Black Hundreds are willing to work with the Octoberists, and the Octoberists can tolerate the cadets, and the cadets are associated with the Mensheviks. Therefore, the Mensheviks equal the Tsarist counter-revolution. It's sort of a transitive property, guilty by association kind of thing. But what all these narratives kind of paper over is that it's kind of defining these varied groups by their worst, most obscure elements. So, just to give you an idea, the Mensheviks hold a Congress in December 1917, where about 11/12 of the leadership vote in favor of the moderate, nonviolent platform, whereas only 1/12 of the leadership assembled vote in favor of formal, violent opposition to the Bolsheviks. This isn't to say that every single Menshevik in the country liked this decision, but this is the broad opinion this is the official opinion of the leadership that they were attempting to enforce. Now, when there is opposition, in spite of this, the party tends to be blamed for every single action and every single member nominally under their banner. So when Mensheviks disregard their own party's commands and violently oppose the Bolsheviks anyway, this is treated as evidence that the entire party is guilty, which is a standard the Bolsheviks themselves don't hold to. Like I said, neither party was able to 100% control the actions of every single member of their party, especially in this era of people rapidly joining and leaving the parties en masse. So I'm not sure if they consciously set out to establish the one-party dictatorship.
Not in the way they did.
It makes
Not in
perfect
the
sense.
sense that,
Right, exactly. So, right, implicitly, it derives naturally downstream from the starting presuppositions, from the kind of Leninist ideal that having multiple parties is weakening the effectiveness of any one class to act unilaterally, which substantiates having a suspicion of these other parties as compromised and ineffectual and treasonous, which in effect only pushes them into an opposition stance, especially as the Bolsheviks begin to remove peaceful alternatives and other avenues with which to protest the actions of the government, whether that be the suppression of the press, the banning of meetings, the banning of the parties outright, meaning if you can't legally contest the Bolsheviks, you essentially leave no other recourse. In particular, the Fifth Soviet Congress. Unfortunately, I've done videos on every single Congress up to this one,
Yeah.
but the Fifth Congress, based on the evidence that we now have, I think it can be asserted confidently that the election was rigged to the point of actually changing the final results, in that the representation was actually changed to prevent the Bolsheviks from losing. The left SRs and the other groups collectively seem to have actually received a majority of the vote, the majority of the delegates to the Congress, in which case their ability to legitimately take part in the system is invalidated,
Mhm.
in which case you kind of leave no other recourse except violent opposition.
Well, and that's what most historians seem to think, that I've come across at least, is like, well, yeah, duh, yeah, the Bolsheviks rigged the election, given how, that seemed obvious to the opposition involved, a lot of the opposition who was debating on even participating,
Yeah.
right? That's the kind of dual bind. It's like, if the risk of the Mensheviks participating in this was that if they participate in it and it's rigged, it legitimizes the Bolsheviks. But if they decline to participate, then maybe it can't be used as a legitimating mechanism, because the purpose of these elections is legitimacy, right? Because why would people obey you if you don't have divine right or whatever? I mean, well, election's a process.
Yeah, they cede ground.
So the Bolsheviks come to power. I just want to recap some things to clarify some of what you're saying regarding like the Bolsheviks not really intending on establishing a one-party dictatorship. Because, like, of course, Lenin wanted to establish a dictatorship of the proletariat, right? But that had a very different meaning as to like, what ended up happening. The party was supposed to represent the proletariat in fighting for a revolution. It wasn't supposed to be who actually ruled everything. In that, Lenin even went, so first, the Bolsheviks, they come to power on the basis of ending the war and saving the Constituent Assembly, saving democracy. Yet, very quickly, upon some of the stuff you mentioned, like having opposition, not being able to fully pass everything they wanted to, having these conflicts with the various parties, the splits, which there's so many crazy things, which I just encourage people to watch your videos to understand. After this sort of rigged election, basically, there was going to be an election that's basically, the Bolsheviks end up dissolving the Constituent Assembly. To sort of fast forward, maybe make things a little more brief. They dissolved the Constituent Assembly, and how did they do that? They didn't say, oh, it's because we're trying to establish a dictatorship. Lenin said, well, this Constituent Assembly, it's really bourgeois democracy. It's not genuine democracy. What's genuine democracy is Soviet democracy. Now, this is a tricky thing because this is actually kind of what the consistent Marxist position is. Kind of. Not so much in the sense that Marx did believe in representation, but in the sense that it's, for Marx, there's a kind of assumption that the workers would be the majority and that you just have sort of like one branch, the legislature was like this one branch. Then it was going to be like people elected directly to it who are going to be workers and yada yada. You can read the Communist Manifesto. Anyway, Lenin kind of has his interpretation of that and makes it seem like this is what he's fulfilling by actually dissolving the Constituent Assembly and disempowering his opposition and empowering the people. I mean, if you look about history, it's actually a very common thing. This is literal classic Caesarism, in the sense that, like, that you empower the people, but as a way to disempower the opposition, to then disempower the people more later. But I do agree with you that I actually think Lenin genuinely believed he was doing the right communist thing here. Because this was kind of supported by like a lot of the radical, more left-wing communists, right? Who believed in councils being the basis of democracy, not the parliamentary representation. They believed in council democracy. This is why there's council communists, right? Rosa Luxemburg even, Rosa Luxemburg was critical of the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly, actually. And so was Karl Kautsky. But anyhow, with this sort of dissolution of that, the big fear, and Karl Kautsky warned about this, was by not having the opposition, which was existing anyway, and some of that opposition had a lot more support than the Bolsheviks did because the country was majority peasants. Like the SRs have just more history than the Bolsheviks do. Like they come out of the Narodnik movement, right?
Right.
So this is like, they have more of social ties there. So it's not a surprise they're more popular than the Bolsheviks, even though there's divisions between them. When you prevent the opposition from contesting power peacefully through elections or compromising with them on various policies, well, then guess what? The only way to resist the Bolsheviks is violence. Yet, as you point out, despite this, a lot of the opposition still didn't resist the Bolsheviks violently. In fact, didn't even join the Allied troops and the whites against the Bolsheviks when the Civil War really turned into what people think of it as, right? The last thing I want to touch on for the public segment, one thing you said is it is misleading to say like all this was inevitable, right?
Yes.
The way the Bolsheviks ended up. And I haven't gotten to that end of the part of the video. I'm not sure where you talk about it, where you say like there was alternative ways the Bolsheviks could have structured a government.
Mhm.
I think they definitely could. However, I think there are reasons why they didn't. And part of that reasons is not actually just the material conditions. It's in the ideology itself.
Yes.
And I do think, yes, ideology is always important. You know, they say it's idealist. Okay, well, if ideas didn't matter, then Marxists wouldn't be so obsessed with the right ideas.
Mhm.
You know, like squabbling over the correct interpretation of X or Y. So it's like, this is already a non-argument to say like they don't matter. Of course they matter. And look, there's this great book that I recommend to people a lot. I'm not sure if you've read it yet. You've read a lot on the subject. Is Hans Kelsen's The Political Theory of Bolshevism.
I don't think so.
Yeah. Hans Kelsen is a really important legal scholar. And he's actually more read usually for his work on law. He also has one of the best books on democracy, which is like kind of like a realist look at democracy, which is Essence and Value of Democracy book. And they're all very short. They're very easy to read. But the one on Bolshevism, even shorter, it's like 65 pages. He makes this interesting argument, which is that he characterizes Bolshevism as anarchism in theory, totalitarianism in practice, which is that, you know, it has the pretense of the abolition of the state, right? Which is rooted in Marxism. You know, you want to abolish the state eventually. It'll wither away, to be clear. The idea is that once you get rid of class conflict, it'll wither away. But because it places the abolishing class before dealing with the state, and it views the state not in terms of limiting it, it's a question of abolishing it or it withering away. So they view the state in this very instrumental way, which is like it's just a mechanism of class rule. So if it's a mechanism of class rule, then it's a function that has to exist as long as there's class struggle. But once you abolish classes, it'll wither away. And Kelsen shows how this actually opens up the door. This like logic of this end goal of communism is a very convenient rationale for the permanent expansion of power. And it's not a coincidence why the state under Stalin, despite even after him declaring that all the opposing classes are liquidated in the 1930s, when he liquidates the kulaks, which had nothing to do with class struggle, by the way. It had to do with bureaucratic domination, as I explain in my video. This permanent expansion of power is enabled in some ways by the rationale that you are going to eventually abolish it. That'll wither away once the class struggle ends. The problem is that even if you theoretically get rid of class struggle in your own country, which itself is used as an excuse to purge enemies, less so prevent class, but once you get rid of classes, as Stalin theoretically did, as he says he did, well, then you have international imperialism. You have international capitalism. And the whole Marxist point is that communism can't work anywhere unless it works everywhere, which is where I think it is absolute baloney. Like, this is where it really is the most poorly thought out ideology ever, like in this particular domain. Because you think about what that actually entails. Like, it's crazy. Like, you really have to have a worldwide successful revolution in order for the state to start to wither away, because class struggle is global, right? Capitalism is global. Well, it's like then you have like a permanent excuse to forever expand the state. And that's what Stalin does. He says, well, you have at the time he thought the British were going to invade them before the Germans, which is funny to think about. But he says, okay, well, the imperialists are going to invade us. The Weimar, the social democrats, they're social fascists. So it's like this excuse of permanent threats abroad is used to just expand the state forever and ever and ever, and to purge people forever and ever and ever, as you see this happen in a cycle in many communist regimes.
Yes.
And the Trotskyists don't have a solution to this. The Trotskyists are just like, okay, well, if the international revolution succeeded, you wouldn't have that. And it's like this is the thing. In some sense, like, yes, the Bolsheviks could have structured the regime differently. I think they could have. If they abandoned the communist, they could have. Because it's actually in the communist dogmas, the Marxist dogmas, to be very specific, honestly, is where you have this excuse to permanently expand power. Because that's the problem with these like vague, nebulous goals like communism, is you can forever like delay the important questions. Kind of like, I hate to compare communism and fascism, but like the fascists also have like a super nebulous goal, right? Like the fulfillment of the nation and having, or in the Nazi case, like, the triumph of the Aryan race, and more what they actually claimed was the expulsion of Judeo-Bolshevism, which they sort of like lumped together in an international Jewry, which yeah, anyway, you get these kind of like goals that are so vague, you can just permanently expand. Whereas if you have de facto limits on what you can do, limitarianism,
Absolutely, yeah.
Then So if you think in terms of not what is the best regime, but what is the least bad regime, you can prevent hell, which might be better than thinking you're going to create heaven and create hell in the process.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. That's a great line. And so you could also look at how ideology sort of necessitated certain decisions, whether that be collectivization, the purges, that they were not necessarily just the consequence of the material conditions or the economics of the situation, what have you.
At this point, if you like these pods, if you're a regular listener, you're pretty much you're doing yourself a disservice by not being a patron. We're going to talk about modern MLs. We're from the back room. Yeah, a little bit. And if you're not part of the back room already, you should become one. You get access to over 80 exclusive episodes, half the conversations, and the Discord, where you can encounter other great minds, some of which have actually been former people who escaped the Marxist-Leninist brain virus, or have at least become reformed tankies, as they call themselves. There's some people who sometimes I know a couple of people in the Discord who call themselves reformed tankies, but they gradually become less and less tanky. It's fun to watch. Anyway, see y'all in the back room, and subscribe.
Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
I am sick and tired of revolutionaries or protest movements which focus on those ecstatic moments. Oh my God, 1 million people on Syntagma Square, on Tahrir in Istanbul, and so on. We were all so enthusiastic there, and so on and so on. I'm not impressed by that at all. I think this is even relatively easy to do. The true test of a revolution or radical social change is how do ordinary people experience the change when the ecstatic moment is over, when things return to normal. That's the most difficult task. When nothing happens, when just everyday life is here, how is this everyday life different from the previous everyday life?